midges that don't have any color. But what they do is act like hundreds of thousands of tiny little mirrors. They bounce light around. That's why iridescent colors seem to change or shift depending on how the light hits them. The rainbow boa gets its actual name from the fact that it has these scales, and at the end of the show, for those of you who stick it out to the end, I'll invite you to the edge of the stage to look at our guest star under the bright stage lights and see if you can see some of those hot pinks, fluorescent blues, purples, yellows, and greens that actually give the rainbow boa its name, rainbow boa. Now the other part of its name, Brazilian, tells us a little bit about where our guest star is from. The steamy tropical rainforests that line the Amazon River in northern Brazil. And how many of you think this snake might be perfectly comfortable hanging out in a tree branch? You got it. You can see it's pretty comfortable hanging out on my arm as if it were a tree branch. That's where you find it in the rainforest, not way up high in the tops of those really big canopy giant trees, but the lower understory trees. And it can find everything it needs to live hanging out in the trees. So everything it wants to eat, for example, slugs, bugs, arthropods, spiders, scorpions, small rodents that run up and down the trees all day long, small birds, and it can even snatch bats out from underneath rainforest leaves where a lot of bats will hang out during the day. So plenty to eat up in the trees. But I will tell you guys that the real reason rainbow boas spend their time in the trees is to avoid predators. These are not giants of the snake world. This snake is probably about 4.5, maybe close to 5 feet long right now. It's about as big as they tend to get. If they get caught on the ground, almost anything that's bigger than they are will try to eat them. Other reptiles, four-footed predators like jaguars, coyotes, etc. So they really try to avoid predators. However, I'm sure there's a couple of people in the audience already who are thinking to themselves, well, I can think of one whole group of predators it's actually pretty hard to avoid hanging out in a tree. Can anybody guess what I'm talking about? Yes. Yeah, smaller cats can actually climb up the trees, but these guys are typically out on very thin branches where some of the bigger cats can't get to, so that's not what I'm getting at. Let me give you a clue. It is the animal that has 2 legs and is covered with feathers. Any kind of predatory bird, and in particular, a bird called the harpy eagle. Has anybody ever heard of harpy eagles? Yeah, pretty impressive predator of the Amazonian rainforest. Now let me give you an idea of what they're like. If you've ever seen one, basically, if you measured from the top of my stage, that bird would be almost up to my hip, 30 to 36 inches high. It has a 7-foot wingspan, talons as big as my hands, and a huge crown of gray feathers that stick up and make it look so fierce that the first Europeans to see it thought of the ancient harpies of Greek legend. And harpy eagles glide over the rainforest canopy or sit in a perch, scanning around with that excellent vision that all birds of prey have. And what birds of prey are usually looking for is just a little tiny movement. They're very good at detecting tiny movements. So all my snake has to do is to stick out its tongue the way it's doing now, and all of a sudden, a harpy eagle can zero in on that tiny movement, swoop down with talons, and pluck it right out of a tree. But that's not the biggest thing a harpy eagle can eat. They eat bigger snakes, they eat monkeys, and they even eat things as big as 3-toed sloths. So really the only predator that our rainbow boa really has to watch out for is the Brazilian rainforest. So that's a little bit about our guest star, and now let's move to part 2, where we use a little bit of science and let our beautiful snake represent for all misunderstood snakes everywhere as we bust some myths. Now, to start this part off, we're going to do another audience survey question. And what I'd like to do right now is to just mention a few of the weird stories or myths I've heard about snakes from all my audiences over the years of doing snake shows at the museum. You guys, what I'd like you to do is to raise your hand when you hear a story that sounds familiar to you. Now don't raise your hand if you believe it. Just raise your hand if you've ever heard it before, because what that does is it gives everyone in the room an idea of how common the these stories about snakes actually are. Okay, for snake myth number 1. Who has ever heard in their lifetime that snakes are slimy? Yeah, I heard that before I ever worked with a snake. Has anybody ever heard that snakes were capable of stinging with their tongue? A few people have heard that one. Has anybody ever heard that snakes could actually sting with their tails? All right. Who's ever heard that snakes have green blood? Who's ever heard that snakes have no bones? Who's heard the legend of the dreaded hoop snake? That's spelled H-O-O-P. See if this story sounds familiar. This was a snake that supposedly could grab its own tail in its teeth and hang on nice and tight. Then it would turn its body into the shape of a big wheel. And then it would roll down hills and terrify hikers. I saw quite a bit of snickering when I told that story. Well, you're right to snicker. That is a totally made-up story about snakes. No snake can move that way. But guess what? All the other stories I told you, also fake, made-up myths. No snake is slimy. No snake stings with its tongue or its tail. No, they do not have green blood. Yes, they have bones. Now, we're not going to get into all those stories. You guys, right at this point, will take our scientific investigation where you want it to go. So I'm going to let you vote from that list which myth you'd like to investigate using a little bit of science. So how many of you would like to use a little bit of science to investigate the slimy story? Okay, put your hands on that. How many of you would like to use some science to investigate the stinging with the tongue tail stories? Okay, a couple of hands on that. How many of you would like to use some science to investigate the green blood stories? More hands on that one. And how many of you would like to use some science to investigate whether or not snakes have bones? Oh, a lot of hands. Okay. So we're going to use science to investigate whether or not snakes have bones. And I'm going to bring the lights up so that we can look at our guest star very, very carefully. So looking at our guest star hanging out here on my arm, wound around and around it, almost like a pretzel. Who thinks if we tried to bend our backbone this way, we'd break a lot of bones trying? You bet we would. So it's easy to assume when we see the snake bent like this that it couldn't possibly have bones. But I need to show you something right off the bat. Now, obviously not a Brazilian rainbow boa. This is a rattlesnake skeleton. But what do you think, folks? Lots of bones in there? Yeah. A ton of bones in there. So something else is obviously going on here. Let's see if we can figure out what. Turns out we can figure out what's going on just by looking at a skeleton like this and asking 3 science questions. So let me put this up on video so we can see a little more closely. All right. So, scientists, looking at this skeleton, does this animal seem to have more backbones than we do? Who says yes? Who says no? Who's not too sure? What if I told you all humans have 32? More than 32 there? Yeah, you don't even need to count them. Well more than 32. Okay, second science question, scientists. Are those backbones smaller than ours? Who says yes? Who says no? Who's not too sure? Never mind, not too sure is in science, right? You always want to admit what you don't know. Well, they are quite a bit smaller. So let me give you an idea of the size of human backbones. Okay, so this is a model of one section of a human backbone. If I measured this section with a ruler, it's about 1 foot long and there's about 12 bones. So each bone is about 1 inch thick. Pretty bendy little section there. But let me show you this piece of python backbone. So if I measured out 12 inches of python backbone, are there more or less than 12 bones? More. It's probably about twice as many, maybe 24. So watch what just that one little 12-inch section at the end can do. Because of those extra bones in the same length, it can double back on itself.